Hello, I'm Pastor Tim Holscher, and thank you for joining me. Continuing to look at the fact that the sin nature and our present experience cannot separate us from God's love. We haven't got down to that great and glorious verse at the end of Romans 8, but Paul is trying to lay a foundation for this, and all of the purpose of this, as we started off in these studies in Romans, if you go back and look at the first one, is to help us become stable. Paul's goal is that believers become stabilized so that when we serve out of a sense of stability in our relationship with God, not out of some objective of gaining something or maintaining something in our relationship with God. And so, as we've been walking through these different aspects of these verses that we often quote, verse 29 of Romans 8, because who he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he should be the firstborn or the heir among many brothers. And then we come to verse 30, whom he foreknew, whom he predestined, these he also called, and whom he called, these he also justified, and whom he justified, these he also glorified. I want to look at the word called today. And what's involved in this. When I was growing up, most of the time when we heard about calling or being called, we were taught it was usually people being called to the ministry. I received a calling, and I received a call to become a pastor. I received a call to become a missionary or an evangelist or something like this. However, very interestingly, the Bible does not use the term call in this way. When it refers to call, it has the word that we're going to look at is frequently somebody's name being called or a place or an event being called. It has several times of people being called to come and attend someplace. But we're also going to see that we have several times when it's applied to us that is talking about God's call to salvation. You're an unsaved person, and God, through the gospel, is calling you to now come to salvation. And I want to look at a verse that I knew growing up, didn't think I understand, or didn't think I would. When I look back and I would say I did not understand this very well, but Matthew 22:11, and it's talking about a king that is making a wedding for his son. And it says in verse 11, but when the king came in to look at the guests, he saw there a man who had no wedding garment. And he said to him, friend, how did you get in here without a wedding garment? And he was speechless. And then the king said to the attendants, bind him hand and foot, cast him into outer darkness, and in that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth, for many are called, but few are chosen. And I knew this very well growing up, because I grew up in a church where we really talked about being chosen. We emphasized what popularly is called election. And so we said the call goes out for many to come to salvation, but few are chosen. And I believe to some degree this is what this is referring to. But this context is talking about the call that goes out to the people of the Jews as well as to the Gentiles, not into the church, but to attend the wedding. And interesting enough, the bride is missing in this event because we are the bride, and the bride, according to Ephesians chapter 5 at the end of the chapter, that is yet a mystery. So it was something that wasn't yet revealed. So this is talking about guests at the wedding, not the bride, which is what the church is. And so there are going to be many people that the call is going to go out to these people, and they're going to gather for this wedding, but they aren't actually chosen. And they come and they're not ready. They're not ready, evidenced here by the fact they don't have a wedding garment. So I just wanted to deal with this passage. While it may illustrate in part something that's still true today, because we extend a call to many by calling people to salvation, by sharing the gospel with them and such. In reality, this really is looking forward to the future. Let's go to Galatians chapter 1. Paul says over here, I am astonished that you are so quickly deserting the one who called you by the grace of Christ and are following or going after then a different kind of gospel. And so he says, you were called by the grace of Christ, called by grace. That's salvation. That's the call, the extent of the call to salvation, and now there's something else that's involved. Galatians 1:15, and when the one who set me apart from birth and called me by his grace. So Paul looks back at a moment in time in which God called him, called Paul to salvation. And then in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 8, it says this persuasion, and in the context, this idea that we could pursue something under law, that we could pursue our own kind of righteousness and look out for ourselves. This persuasion, he says, does not come from the one who calls you. So he's, again, none of these are talking about a call to service. Primarily, these are talking about the call to salvation. Okay? Despite the fact, the way that we use it. I'm not exactly for sure why we came to use that word call, except that maybe somebody said, hey, I think I should become a pastor. And somebody said, why? Well, I was sitting in meetings and I felt this tug on my heartstrings. And I think God was calling me to ministry. And people gravitate towards that. I'm not for sure, but I don't find evidence normally for that, for really that idea that you are called to ministry or something of that nature. Furthermore, in Galatians 5:13, in this same context, it says, for you were called to freedom, brothers. Do not use your freedom as an opportunity. So part of our salvation involves being called unto freedom. Let's go over to 1 Thessalonians. I have 1 Peter here. I am trying to find the 1 Thessalonians one here. 1 Thessalonians 2:5. Let's see if we can go back here, because it's not showing up. 1 Thessalonians 2:12, sorry. Exhorting and encourage you and insisting that you live in a way worthy of the God who calls you to his own kingdom and glory. So God has called us to come into his kingdom. That was the call to salvation. And at the end of the book in 1 Thessalonians 5, when he's talking about the issue of the spirit, the soul, and the body, and that they'll all be made whole and complete, and this is what Paul wishes, he states his confidence in verse 24, he who calls you is trustworthy, he will in fact do it. In other words, God called you to salvation, called you to a whole salvation, and he will finish that salvation, which is exactly what we're looking at in Romans 8. 2 Thessalonians 2:14, again, he called you to this salvation through our gospel. So they were called to this salvation. Over in 1 Peter in chapter 1 in verse 15, he's telling these people, calling them to a holy conduct. And he says, like the Holy One who called you, or like the one that called you is holy, become holy in your conduct. So he called you. These people understood what he was talking about. He called them to salvation. And if we look down again in chapter 2 and verse 9, we're going to find something similar to what we just looked at over in 1 Thessalonians. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people of his own, so that you may proclaim the virtues of the one who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. See, he called us out of the realm of darkness. Calling, as we're looking at this in Romans chapter 8, this is the call to salvation. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ, he called you, you heard that call, and you responded to that call. That's why you're saved now, because you heard the call and you've responded to that call. And I think it's very important for us to understand God has called us to salvation. He going back up here, he foreknew us, because he'd planned this, and so he had this fully set in mind. Second of all, he set out boundaries for us to be conformed. And because he had set out those boundaries ahead of time, he then calls us to salvation, to call us to enter in to the relationship that he fully knows, because he's the one that planned it, and the relationship in which he has predestined or set the boundaries for us. He's called us into that. You've been called. If you're a believer in Jesus Christ, you've been called into this relationship with God, into this salvation. And you believed that message that Jesus Christ came into the world, died for your sins, that he was buried and that he rose again. And you knew when you believed that alone was what God asked you to do, to believe, and He alone could forgive your sins and make you righteous with Him by believing that. And He called you. That was the call. And that gospel, as Paul said, He called us by this gospel. That's something to think about. God called you. It's a good thing to encourage you when things are out of sorts, and you're struggling and you're frustrated, to remember God called you. It'll encourage you in having a good day in the Lord. Thank you for joining me today.